I consider Captain America Civil War to be a very enjoyable installment of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. After all, it adapts one of Marvel Comics' most famous crossovers, has a compelling ideological conflict between Captain America and Iron Man, and gives a satisfying bookend to the Captain America trilogy. When the movie was being promoted, fans were asked, whose side are you on? Team Cap or Team Iron Man? Well, of course, I was on Team Cap. Besides the fact that it's his movie, he's Captain freaking America. He's always on the right side. That is, barring mind control, replacement by shapeshifters. But when I left the movie, I started thinking about the argument that the conflict centered around. The idea of the Avengers running around the world independently without any supervision to right wrongs and beat up the bad guys is a great fantasy. But this movie takes that idea and introduces real-world questions about international politics and accountability. Whenever realism, and I'm using the term realism very loosely here, is introduced to fantasy, the fantasy rarely holds up. Hello everyone, and welcome to Never the End, the show where I overanalyze and compare all things geek. Today, I'm going to be talking about the politics of Captain America Civil War, and after formerly being on Team Cap, I'm going to explain to you why Tony Stark is right and give you the argument for Team Iron Man. A quick side note before we begin. For the following video essay, I am only considering the MCU movies to be canon. I am aware that episodes of Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. may have fleshed out the terms of the Sokovia Accords. However, since whether Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. is canon in the MCU is debatable at best, I will only be acknowledging evidence presented by the movies. Movie recap. Captain America Civil War begins with the Avengers attempting to prevent Crossbones from getting a biological weapon in Lagos, Nigeria's largest city. When caught, Crossbones tries to kill himself and Cap by suicide bombing. Wanda saves Captain America with her telekinetic powers, but by diverting the explosion, civilians, including several Wakandan humanitarian workers, are killed. Due to the political fallout from this and other Avengers-related incidents, the Sokovia Accords are introduced. According to the Sokovia Accords, which have been ratified by over 117 nations, the Avengers are no longer able to go and do whatever they want. Instead, they must submit to supervision by a United Nations panel. This creates conflict amongst the Avengers, with the pro-Accords faction headed by Iron Man and the anti-Accords side led by Captain America. A debate of accountability versus individual liberty. Part 1. International Politics. Through their actions in Nigeria, the Avengers are conducting what amounts to a dangerous military operation in a foreign nation. An operation the government of this country is not aware of and thus has not consented to. Furthermore, although Captain America is an Army veteran and has previously worked for the United States government, S.H.I.E.L.D. has been dissolved after the events of Captain America Winter Soldier. Although originally assembled by S.H.I.E.L.D. director Nick Fury, the Avengers are now a completely independent military organization with no official ties to any government. This means Cap and friends are operating under no one's authority other than their own. Therefore, when the Avengers, a private military organization, conducts combat missions in Nigerian territory without the consent of their elected government, this can be considered a violation of an independent nation's sovereignty. Some in the audience might be confused as to why the Avengers are being chastised for being superheroes and flying their super cool Quinjet to Africa to beat up the bad guys. Sure, some civilians died, but more people could have suffered if the supervillains had gotten the weapon. So, what's the problem? Well, let's change a couple of aesthetic details to give us some perspective. Imagine if a super soldier named, say, Captain Iran led a bunch of self-described superheroes based in the Middle East to Wisconsin, USA to stop Hydra from stealing a chemical weapon. Captain Iran and his friends conduct this operation without the knowledge or consent of the United States government, and American civilians are killed in the crossfire. Such an event could easily become the match that sets off World War III. The Nigerian incident is also particularly embarrassing from the perspective of General Ross and the US government. Steve Rogers has, independently of the United States Armed Forces, conducted a military operation in a foreign country that resulted in civilian deaths, the entire time calling himself Captain America, using advanced weaponry that technically belongs to the US government, all the while being literally draped in the American flag. Allowed to continue on their present course, the Avengers are an international incident waiting to happen, which Cap, in his star-spangled uniform, could easily drag the United States into. While we are on the topic of United States foreign policy, it is worth mentioning that Captain America's military interventions, playing the world police as it were, are not dissimilar to the aggressive US foreign policy that has been the status quo for decades now. Whether intentional on the part of the writers or not, the parallel of Captain America leading a military strike force around the world without regard for international law, to the United States military intervention in a number of countries equally dismissive of international law, is difficult to ignore once seen. Furthermore, if we take Captain America's international military actions to be an analog to those of the United States, the idea of United Nations oversight takes on new meaning. In the early 2000s, the decision for the United States to invade Iraq was being hotly debated. America went to the United Nations for support, however, they were refused, and military action against Iraq was condemned and considered illegal under international law. The Bush administration ignored the UN's decision and waged war anyway. Today, the Iraqi invasion is considered to be the greatest foreign policy disaster in modern American history. The result of the United States ignoring the decision of the United Nations and unilaterally invading Iraq is $7 trillion of taxpayer money spent, thousands of United States soldiers killed in action, and a minimum of 200,000 Iraqi civilians dead. A war that was intended to make the world safer caused massive destabilization in the Middle East and allowed terrorist organizations like ISIS to gain a foothold. Military action resulted in chaos and destruction because the United States decided that they knew better and ignored the will of the international community. Part 2. The Avengers are human too. Well, mostly. The world of the MCU is a very melodramatic place. While there are instances of nuance and moral complexities, it is still fairly easy to make the distinction between superheroes and supervillains. The only reason that we, as rational human beings, would ever even consider allowing the Avengers to operate as an independent force without accountability or even jurisdiction is because we, as the audience, know that they are the good guys. They're just written that way. Which is of course not to say that they don't have flaws and failings, but all the Avengers are, at their core, good people. Unfortunately, there is no way to be certain that the members of the Avengers will always remain so. Even assuming that Captain America had remained active and led the team for the foreseeable future, he was never going to be around forever. Sooner or later, the roster of the Avengers was bound to change and other powered individuals would inevitably take over. When this happens, the citizens of the world have no guarantee that the Avengers' successors will be as morally upstanding. The Falcon and the Winter Soldier series actually gives us a peek at what a dangerous new Avenger could look like with the mentally unstable John Walker. The people who take over may, in Cap's own words, have their own agendas. When we watch the Avengers on screen, we know them to be overall highly moral, altruistic, and relatively apolitical. However, it's inevitable that superhumans will join the team who have their own codes, motivations, and political agendas, as well as other flaws that are not readily apparent when they are invited to join. When thinking about the kind of people that may join the Avengers' future lineup, it's important to remember that Iron Man and Ant-Man are both examples of superheroes who are created by private industries. In a world with the technological capabilities of the MCU, some large corporations may decide to start manufacturing their own superheroes, both for private protection and good PR. Imagine a world where ExxonMobil, Amazon, or even Facebook created their own superheroes. While we know that Tony Stark and Hank Pym would never do anything unscrupulous with their superhero status for financial gain, can we expect the same of Jeff Bezos or Mark Zuckerberg? If left unchecked, the Avengers could easily devolve into a group of highly powered, unelected individuals who run around the world with no safeguards, enforcing their own brand of justice, which is influenced by their ideological, political, or even financial interests. Even supposing that the Avengers retains a membership of morally outstanding individuals, there is nothing preventing other groups of superhumans from forming their own globe-trotting super teams. Part 3. Captain America's response. Captain America does have some valid criticisms of the Accords. For example, what if this panel sends us somewhere we don't think we should go? What if there's somewhere we need to go and they don't let us? Now, going somewhere they aren't permitted to isn't going to change because, as we've already gone over, it would be very easy for the Avengers to disrupt world politics or even start a war. But the panel sending them somewhere they don't think they should go is a valid concern. Which brings us to this scene, where Tony approaches Steve with his self-described olive branch.
I'm not saying it's impossible, but there would have to be safeguards.
Sure. Once we put out the PR fire, these documents can be amended.
Steve is considering signing on to the Accords on the condition that there are safeguards, and Tony assures him that amendments can be made as soon as the PR disaster is averted. This brings us to what Captain America should be fighting for. Instead of demanding the right to go all over the world without regard for the concerns of local governments, Cap needs to accept that some oversight is necessary for the people they protect to trust them again. What he can do is use the political weight of himself and the other Avengers to demand veto power. Early in the movie, General Ross offers the Avengers a choice: acting in accordance with the Sokovia Accords or retirement. Considering that alien invasions, attacks from extra-dimensional Norse gods, and various other superhuman threats are a very real concern in the MCU, the international community would still much rather have the Avengers around than not. This is why the Avengers are offered a deal, instead of being forced into retirement like the superheroes of the Incredibles universe. Captain America and the others can use the fact that protection is still wanted to make a counteroffer. The Avengers will abide by the UN panel's decisions against military operations that are deemed unreasonable, as long as the Avengers cannot be ordered to go anywhere or do anything that the team does not consent to do. For a moment, it seems that Cap will accept this compromise, until...
I'd file a motion to have you and Wanda reinstated.
Wanda? What about Wanda?
She's fine. She's confined to the compound currently. Vision's keeping her company.
Oh, God, Tony, every time I think
Steve becomes furious when Tony mentions he'll have to file a motion to get himself and Wanda reinstated. However, his anger is completely irrational because Wanda is at the center of a political disaster that caused over 100 countries to demand the Sokovia Accords. Steve Rogers himself was just caught assaulting German police while aiding and abetting the Winter Soldier, who, although we as the audience know is innocent, is considered to be a dangerous terrorist by the public. He is furious that Wanda is confined to Tony Stark's mansion. However, since her actions led to the deaths of civilians in a foreign country, shouldn't she technically be in a Nigerian jail? The only reason she is not in an African prison doped up to her eyeballs to prevent her from using her powers appears to be Tony Stark's influence. Temporary house arrest in an enormous mansion with Wi-Fi, flat screens, and all sorts of other goodies seems like a pretty sweet deal compared to the alternative. Steve's only defense for Wanda is that she's a kid, which actually makes his position worse because it means that he's the one who took a kid, the amount of training she's received is unknown, to participate in a dangerous military operation. Captain America destroys any chance of a reasonable compromise because he is angry that his actions have received any semblance of consequence. Despite the fact that what Steve and Wanda did would land any normal person in prison, it seems that they'll both be active Avengers again after a short suspension period. Yet this slap on the wrist seems enough cause for Cap to walk away from negotiation. Part 4. The debate falls apart. The ideological debate of Captain America's Civil War is an interesting one. Individual liberty versus government authority. The powers of the protectors versus the rights of the people to determine how they are protected. Both Captain America and Iron Man have valid arguments for their positions, which are consistent with their respective character developments over the movies that have led to this point. Unfortunately, the problem with this movie is that the ideological debate gets swept aside in order to serve the Winter Soldier plot. In fact, all of the physical conflict between the members of the Avengers is caused by the controversy over the Winter Soldier. The biggest fight of the movie is framed as being caused by the ideological debate, but really, the Winter Soldier and the Sokovia Accords have almost nothing to do with each other. As stated before, Captain America, having physically assaulted German police in order to protect Bucky Barnes, aka the Winter Soldier, aka the world's most wanted terrorist, and then helping him remain free after escaping custody, would have already made Steve an international outlaw regardless of whether or not the Accords were ratified. When Falcon and Cap find Bucky after Zemo's jailbreak and discover he was framed for the bombing, they don't even try and tell Tony because they're not sure if he would believe them. And even if he did, they don't know if the Sokovia Accords would let him help anyway. Which is, of course, ridiculous, because there is no downside to getting this information to Stark. Since Steve and Sam have Sharon Carter on their team, who is not only an expert in espionage, but she is effectively their agent on the inside, Sharon should be able to get this information to Tony without exposing their location. And since a tech genius like Tony should be aware of the incredible face-disguising technology that exists in their world, as demonstrated by Captain America the Winter Soldier, and since Bucky was broken out of super prison under suspicious circumstances by an unknown third party, it seems unlikely that someone as smart as Tony Stark wouldn't at least investigate the possibility of a frame job. Eventually, when Tony does find evidence of Bucky's innocence, he immediately goes to help Bucky and Cap without telling the powers that be what he's doing, which seems to confirm not giving him the vital information from the get-go was a huge mistake. This leads to the final confrontation between Captain America and Iron Man, which, while visually spectacular and does carry great emotional weight, happens completely independently of their ideological differences. The climactic fight starts because Zemo reveals that Bucky killed Tony's parents while under mind control, which drives Iron Man into a violent rage, so he attempts to kill Bucky. Look, it's great for a movie to raise a complicated question without an easy answer, and it is perfectly legitimate for a movie to end without answering the question and leaving the audience to decide the answer for themselves. The issue with Captain America Civil War is that the story abandons its ideological conflict halfway through the movie, replacing it with personal drama, and the story never acknowledges this change. Right before the airport battle scene, Iron Man tells Cap, "I'm trying to keep you from tearing the Avengers apart," to which he replies, "You did that when you signed." Once again, the fact that Steve has been aiding and abetting a wanted terrorist already makes him a criminal. The Sokovia Accords have done nothing to change that. And what's also disappointing about this movie is the fact that the Sokovia Accords, which everyone is up in arms about, never really matter again. They are alluded to during Infinity War to explain why the Avengers are split up, but none of the concerns regarding the Accords are ever explored. The audience never gets to see what happens when Iron Man's Avengers are barred from fighting in a foreign country, and they're never ordered to fight any battles they didn't agree to. And after Infinity War, the Sokovia Accords don't even come up again until the She-Hulk series, where Matt Murdock mentions that they've been repealed. Which means this enormous political issue, which caused such a divide between two of Earth's mightiest heroes, has been rendered into little more than an afterthought in the MCU, with the potentially very interesting results and implications of which never to be explored. Part 5. In Final Analysis. In Final Analysis, Steve Rogers is well-intentioned in his efforts, but, as is often said, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Running around the world conducting private military operations will inevitably lead to major problems with diplomatic relations, or possibly even all-out war. Even though Steve Rogers is not trying to enforce any agenda, aside from the general safety of the world, there is no guarantee that subsequent incarnations of the Avengers, or other super teams that rise up, will be as averse to corruption as the current Avengers roster. Captain America wants to protect the people of the world, but he also must recognize that the people of the world must also have a voice in how they are protected. In a world where superheroes are real, the citizens of that world would need a system of accountability and oversight, just like is demanded of any police force. In order to prevent international political disasters and retain the integrity of the team, the best option for everyone is to negotiate a version of the Accords which allows the world nations to retain their individual sovereignty, but also allows the Avengers to decline any action the team deems unjust. Although noble and altruistic, the Avengers are a group of unelected, incredibly powerful individuals who amount to a protective presence in the world. However, there are no safeguards in place to prevent a change in leadership from transforming them into a malevolent authoritarian force. Iron Man is right in the argument because he recognizes from his own mistakes that in order to prevent the corruption of any government, organization, or super team, a system of checks and balances is required. But what do you think? Do you think Tony Stark is right, or are you still Team Cap all the way? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and hit that bell for notifications. And remember, this is never the end. So I'll see you next time.